talking about the survival of local government in the United States, the right of local or state governments to control what your zoning regulations are, what sort of roads, housing, and schools get built in your towns, what kind of local taxes get levied, and even what your children actually get taught in their schools. Of course, these kinds of things have always been local or state responsibilities. The Constitution leaves these sorts of decisions to the states, and the states traditionally delegate most of these decisions to local governments. Now, for a long time, people have considered this reliance on local government to be an absolutely fundamental key to America's freedom. In fact, it all began here, of course, in New England. The early colonies were almost like little countries unto themselves. They were controlled locally, not by kings back in England. And even when the English kings finally started to assert their control, they limited themselves to certain central powers. They gave up power to the localities because New Englanders, unlike so many of their own subjects, were already used to governing themselves, already accustomed to their freedom. And of course, when the English started to step on that freedom, the colonists kicked them out. Now, when Europeans came to visit the United States in the early decades of the 1800s, they were shocked to see American government working from the bottom up instead of from the top down. And the ultimate in bottom-up government, the most amazing thing of all to these European visitors, was the New England Town Meeting, which of course has been going on here in New Hampshire for about 375 years now. It was when those European visitors first began to notice New England town meetings and how different they were from anything these Europeans were used to back in their own centrally controlled countries, that the meaning of American liberty started to become clear. Because Americans were used to governing themselves, were confident in governing themselves, and were proud of governing themselves, they refused to accept the kind of infringements on their liberties that people in other parts of the world put up with. And the place Americans learned the most about that freedom was in their local governments, like in those town meetings. And that, of course, is how you got Live Free or Die here in New Hampshire. But local government, this key to what makes America American and what makes America great, is perilously close to slipping away. And it's happening in ways that barely get noticed and barely get talked about in our major national debates. Now, the first example of this problem I want to talk about today is a hugely transformative new housing regulation issued by the Obama administration with very little discussion. It's called, and this is a mouthful, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Regulation. And it's not too strong to say that this regulation goes a very long way toward abolishing local government in America. The Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule amounts to a kind of backdoor annexation of America's towns and suburbs by nearby big cities, with the whole process monitored and managed by the federal government. And the second example I'm going to talk about today is the way that the College Board, the private company that creates the SAT tests and all the high school advanced placement tests, has been taking us very far down the road to a national school curriculum controlled by the political left. And this is something the College Board has been doing with considerable help from both state and federal government. Now, everybody knows that President Obama began his career as a community organizer, but very few people understand the projects that young Barack Obama was actually working on during his community organizing days. It turns out that the community organizers who trained and mentored President Obama were the founders of a movement called Regionalism. Basically, Obama's mentors worked in cities, and they didn't at all like suburbs. Obama's mentors blamed the suburbs for the problems of the cities, because when people move out to the suburbs, they take their tax money with them. So the goal of Obama's community organizing mentors was to redistribute suburban tax money to the cities by having cities literally annex their surrounding suburbs. Now, this is actually what happened as a lot of large American cities like New York and Chicago were growing during the 19th century. In those days, as they grew, Cities like New York and Chicago would just annex the nearby towns. Now, if big cities across the country started annexing and absorbing nearby towns and suburbs, this would shift America away from a system of local governments that stay close to the people to a system of huge regional governments centered around major metropolitan areas. Well, of course, things have changed since the 19th century, and the leaders of the regionalist movement quickly discovered that nowadays cities aren't allowed to just annex nearby local governments without their consent. So when the regionalist community organizers who trained and mentored Barack Obama found out that annexation just wasn't possible anymore, they started to work on Plan B. They started to look for ways to undercut the political and economic independence of the suburbs so that they could somehow get a hold of all that suburban tax money and redistribute it to the cities. And the program these regionalists came up with had three basic elements. First, do everything you can to discourage people from leaving big cities to move to smaller towns or suburbs. So, for example, some cities like Portland, Oregon, actually draw a boundary around themselves. It's called an urban growth boundary. And outside of that boundary, new development is banned. You can't build new suburbs or towns outside of Portland's growth boundary. And in other cities, regionalists tried to achieve essentially the same thing by cutting off money for highway building or highway repair and channeling that money instead into public transportation. In fact, I think we're going to hear another presentation a little later that touches on this. Now, if part one of the regionalist program is to discourage people from leaving cities, or even to press them back into the cities, the second part of the regionalist program is to move many of the urban poor into the suburbs through the imposition of low-income housing quotas. And the third part of the regionalist program is to institute something called regional tax-based sharing, which we see in its pure form in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. In the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, suburbs have been forced by the state to kick in a big chunk of their tax revenues to a common regional pool. And once that money gets pulled, it's redistributed according to a formula that pulls most of that money away from the suburbs and back toward the cities. Well, if you press suburbanites into the cities and you transfer urbanites to the suburbs and you redistribute suburban tax money to the cities, then in a sense you've abolished the suburbs. The municipal boundaries would still exist, but for all practical purposes, the towns and municipalities that surround big cities would have been co-opted into a single metropolitan region. And again, that's why people call the movement that favors these policies regionalism. And President Obama, like the people he worked with all those years ago in Chicago, is a strong supporter of the regionalist movement, as are a great many officials in the Obama administration, especially in places like the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Transportation. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which President Obama's hugely ambitious new rule on affirmatively furthering fair housing aims to fulfill the goals of the regionalist movement. I can only give you a few examples here. I've written a lot more about it at National Review Online and elsewhere. President Obama's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule gives the federal government a lever to re-engineer every American neighborhood, imposing a preferred racial and ethnic and class composition, and making new development much more urbanized, much more densely packed. Under this new federal regulation, towns and suburbs are going to become more like cities, and cities are going to become more like Manhattan. They're going to get more crowded and more dense. And to achieve all of this, the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation casts aside the authority of local governments over their core responsibilities on everything from zoning to transportation to education. So, for example, This new rule forces every municipality that accepts federal housing money to compare their population by race, ethnicity, and class to the population of their entire region. And if there are any imbalances in the demographics, then these localities could be forced to sweep away their own zoning laws, build high-density public housing at their own expense, and import population from other parts of the region. Meanwhile, other localities could be forced, on pain of losing their federal funding, to join regional planning associations that adopt all the basic city planning goals of the regionalist movement. In other words, under the Obama administration, the federal government is going into the business of telling Americans where they should live. In fact, all of this is happening right now in suburban Westchester County, New York. And amazingly, the biggest controversy of all is taking place in Hillary Clinton's hometown of Chappaqua, which is in Westchester County. This is where the Obama administration is trying to force the local town council to build high-density, low-income housing at its own expense and import tenants from nearby cities. Yet Hillary Clinton has so far refused to comment on this controversy, and no one in the media and no one among her political rivals have yet asked her about it. But if Hillary Clinton becomes our next president, then President Obama will have handed her the ultimate tool for re-engineering the United States, a regulation that makes a mockery of America's long and proud tradition of local control, a regulation that actually puts the federal government into the business of telling Americans where they ought to live. All right, now I'm going to shift to what might seem like a totally different issue, but what really isn't a different issue at all, because it's all a question of local control.
Crop TV.